in a multicultural society. You just have to look around you to see people from different cultural backgrounds. This makes our society really interesting and really fun. However, it does also create some challenges, particularly when we're communicating. When we're communicating with people from different cultural backgrounds than our own, we often bring different sets of assumptions to that communication and to that situation. And we see this play itself out in the workplace quite frequently. What we're going to do in this session is take a look at some very basic frameworks for culture and for cross-cultural communication so that we can better understand what happens when we work with and communicate with people from different cultural backgrounds. And with that understanding, we can then become more effective at working in a multicultural organization. We'll start the session by taking a look at different definitions of culture, because culture is actually a fairly challenging and complex concept to define. Then we'll take a look at some basic frameworks that we can use to really understand what culture is and therefore what happens when people from different cultures interact. We'll take a deeper look at those interaction processes. So when person A and person B from two different cultural backgrounds interact, what does happen? Then we'll take a look at a concept called intercultural competence. And this is the idea that we can train ourselves and learn to become more effective at functioning in a multicultural environment. And we'll wrap the session up just by taking a look at an action plan that you can put into place to become more interculturally competent. So let's get started. There are a lot of different ways to define culture. It is not a simple concept to get our brains around. It might seem simple, so you might think, oh, culture is the food that people eat or the clothing they wear or the types of buildings they live in. But if culture were that easy, then we wouldn't have challenges when we interact with people from different cultural backgrounds. So there's a lot more to culture than we might initially think. We're going to take a look at a few definitions of culture, and I'll point out some key concepts that each definition highlights. One single definition of culture is not adequate to really understand the concept. So what we need to do is look at multiple definitions and then pull out the key points from each definition and add them to our overall understanding of culture. So here's the first definition. Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. What we want to look at with this definition is that it really helps us to understand that there are multiple layers to culture. There's knowledge, there's art, and there's all these other layers. But the other important part from this definition is that it's something that we have when we belong to a society. So it's part of what we have when we belong to a group of people. There are no cultures of one person out there. Culture is always something that a group develops or a group agrees to. The next definition is culture is the context within which we exist, think, feel, and relate to others. It is our collective identity. This definition is really good because it lets us know the full scope of context. It's everything that we do on a daily basis, as we think, as we eat, as we interact. Everything we do relates back to this concept of culture. The other key part of this definition is the word identity. Culture is something that's very closely aligned with our personal identities. Even though it's something that we acquire as a group, we take it into ourselves as part of our identities. Here's the next definition. Big C culture encompasses the artistic achievements of a society, for example, art and music. Little C culture encompasses behaviors into which participants in a culture are socialized, beliefs, perceptions, and appropriateness. The Big C, Little C definition of culture is useful for a couple of reasons. First of all, Big C culture is what we used to think of as culture. It used to be the art and the music, all of these higher level manifestations of a culture. But researchers and academics realized that this was really inadequate. It didn't capture the everydayness of our culture and our identities that go with those cultures. So the Big C, Little C is actually a very useful way to look at things. The other piece of this definition that's really useful is that It's something that we acquire. So the idea of culture is that we're socialized into it or we acquire it as we're growing up. So it's passed down from our grandparents to our parents to us through both explicit and implicit instruction almost. So we're taught how to have a culture. And here's the final definition that we'll look at. Culture is ways of doing things and ways of thinking. Culture is an everyday thing. It does not have to be very sophisticated. This definition is important because it captures the idea that culture actually affects how we think and how we perceive the world. If culture were just things that we made and things that we saw, it would not actually be that problematic of a concept. But it's much more than that. It actually affects how we think. And in turn, this affects how we communicate, which is really important when it comes to looking at culture in the workplace. Now that we've looked at a few definitions of culture and highlighted some key pieces of each definition, I'd like you to try yourself to define culture. You can use some of the pieces we've looked at from these definitions, or you can come up with your own ideas. So use only 2 or 3 sentences to define for yourself what culture is. As we move through the rest of this session, keep in mind these different definitions of culture. You'll see different pieces of the definitions come into play as we look at the frameworks and additional concepts that have to do with culture and being effective in a multicultural context. Now we're going to take a look at some frameworks that we can use to further understand what culture is and also to analyze what happens when we interact across cultures. The first framework that we'll look at is called the tourist definition of culture. This framework is really useful because this is the very first thing about any culture that we see when we go into a new cultural context. So we see things, we smell things, we hear things, and these help us get an initial impression of that culture. So the tourist definition of culture has us look at the art, the music, the monuments and buildings, the food, the clothing, and the festivals. So this definition of culture first gives us the tangible pieces of that culture. Let's put this tourist definition to work by taking a look at Canada. So if someone comes into Canada for the very first time, what will they see? What might they smell? What might they hear? So if it were winter time, people would see everyone dressed up in heavy winter coats and hats and mitts and scarves, anything that it takes to stay warm. They might see people out ice skating, so they'll see skates, they'll see skis, they'll see hockey equipment, they might see snowshoes and snowmobiles. They might see maple syrup. That's a very Canadian piece of the tourist definition. The other thing that they will definitely see is Tim Hortons. There's a Tim Hortons everywhere, and people are always walking around with their cup of Tim Hortons coffee. So Tim Hortons is actually a very integral part, believe it or not, of the Canadian tourist definition. The next framework that we'll take a look at is called the Iceberg Analogy. And this allows us to dig a little bit more deeply into what culture is. So it takes us further than the tourist definition allows. Everyone knows what an iceberg is. It's a big chunk of ice, and above the water we see a little bit of the iceberg, and underneath the water we see a huge, huge chunk of the iceberg. So the largest percent of the iceberg is below the water. This is really important for culture because it allows us to understand that with culture, there's a piece that we see above the water, so that's our seen culture or our in-awareness culture. And then there's a piece of culture, and it's the larger piece, that's underneath the water. So this is the unseen piece, or the out-of-awareness piece of culture. Why is this important? It's really important because culture is a very difficult concept, and we might think what we see at the top is all there is to a culture. But that's actually not the case. There's this huge unseen piece of culture. And the unseen piece of culture is what gets us into trouble when we're communicating with people from a different cultural background. Remember the story of the Titanic? It wasn't the part of the iceberg that they could see that took the Titanic down. It was the part of the iceberg that they couldn't see. And the same is true with culture. The part of the culture that we can't see is the part that's underneath the water. That's the part that will take us down. Let's apply this new framework, the Iceberg Analogy, to Canadian culture. So with the tourist definition, we already have a pretty good idea of what's above the water with Canadian culture. This is our winter clothing, our winter sports. It could be our summer activities like canoeing, swimming, water skiing, all that good stuff. Camping is in there as well. And it's also things like our Tim Hortons coffee and our maple syrup and all that good stuff. I'm getting hungry talking about this actually. So that's our above the water culture. But underneath, there's a lot more going on when it comes to Canadian culture. So we've got things going on with Canadian culture such as a belief in equality. So in Canadian culture, we very much believe that people are equal regardless of gender, regardless of ethnic background, regardless of religion. The other thing that you'll see underneath the surface in Canadian culture is a strong belief in rules. So we believe in rules to help our society function more smoothly, and we believe in following those rules. So these are things underneath the surface when it comes to Canadian culture. The next framework we'll take a look at is called the onion analogy. And this analogy or this framework lets us dig even more deeply into the concept of culture. So far we've looked at the tourist definition, which is kind of what we initially see with a culture. Then we've looked at this idea of an iceberg with our seen parts and our unseen parts. The onion analogy allows us to dig much more deeply into this whole idea of the unseen part of a culture. So we all know what an onion looks like. It has lots of layers, and so we can peel one layer off and we see another layer, and we peel that layer off and we see another layer. So we can think of culture as being the same. We've got the front or the outside of the onion that we see right off the bat, and we peel another layer off, peel that layer off, and there's something else underneath, and we peel that layer off and there's something else underneath. So we can define these layers of culture in terms of an onion as our products layer, so that's our outside piece. Our behaviors layer is our next piece. And then right at the core of the onion, we have our ideas or our values and beliefs. Let's apply the onion analogy once again to Canadian culture. And we're going to start from the inside and work out because the onion analogy really allows us to explain what we see on the outside based on what's in the inside. So going back to our iceberg analogy, we introduced the idea that a core thing that's unseen with Canadian culture is this belief in equality. So equality regardless of gender, race, and religion. So that would be at the core of the onion. So that's a core value or core idea. Then around that, we see different behaviors based on that core value. So we'll see people treating each other politely and kindly. Everyone always says, oh, Canadians are so polite. Well, one of the reasons for this is this core belief in equality, that we need to treat everyone as we would ourselves like to be treated. And then at the products layer, we see a lot of different laws that enforce this idea of equality. So all of our laws apply to everyone. So that's the outside layer of the culture related to this idea of equality. Let's take a look at another aspect of Canadian culture to further illustrate the idea of the onion. So another core idea of Canadian culture is tolerance. So we have this idea that we have to be accepting of things that are different. So difference is not threatening, difference is interesting. And so we take a look at difference and we embrace difference. We don't want everyone to be exactly the same. So that's a core value. The behavior around that is that we actually are very curious about things that are different. So we'll ask people, where are you from? If we see them dressed slightly differently, well, what's the meaning of what you're wearing? Or can you share your music with me? Or can you explain your artwork or your art that goes along with your cultural background? So the behavior there is just a lot of curiosity about difference. So rather than being afraid of difference, we have a curiosity towards difference. And then the outside layer, the products that we see, are once again actually some laws and legislation that allow for tolerance and don't allow for intolerance. The next framework we're going to look at lets us dig even more deeply into that core of the onion, or the values piece of the onion. These frameworks are called values continuums, and I say frameworks because there's multiple continuums that we're going to look at. A researcher called Geert Hofstede had a really interesting research methodology with which to try and figure out how are different cultures different at the core. So how do we define, or first of all identify and then define the core ways that cultures differ. And so what he did is he went into different IBM locations all over the world, and he tried to figure out how is each IBM local head office different than the other IBM head offices worldwide. And this allowed him to take a structure that was sort of the same, so IBMs are fairly consistent, but then see what are the small differences among that sameness. And this in turn allowed him to figure out the values that were different within each of these IBM local head offices. He was able to identify key values that would differentiate one culture from another culture. And then he created what are called values continuums. And these are values that are polar opposites. So one value over here is very different from this value over here, and then cultures fall somewhere on this line or this imaginary line that joins these two opposites. So this is the idea of values continuums. We'll take a look at some of the key values continuums that Hofstede came up with. And there's also a few more because many researchers followed him in identifying different cultural values. The first values continuum we'll look at is one called power distance. And power distance is all about how people in a culture accept or don't accept the overt or the explicit exhibition of someone's power. So if I have lots of power over you, for example, if I'm in a high power distance culture, I'm actually allowed to show that I have my power. Okay, so I dress differently, I'll have a different kind of house, I'll have a different kind of car, I might have a lot of people serving me or helping me. When people greet me, they might bow. They might actually use a different level of language or a different dialect when they're speaking to me. And I'm actually allowed to treat them differently as well. I might be allowed to, for example, yell at someone if they don't do something right. I'm allowed to fire people without them being able to push back at me. So I have a lot of power and I'm allowed to show it. So that's a high power distance culture. At the opposite end, we have a low power distance culture. And in this type of culture, we're actually not allowed to demonstrate that we've got a lot of power. We may still have that power, but we can't throw it around, so to speak. So if I have a lot of power, I'm probably going to dress just the same as everyone else. Our conversation styles will be similar. I'm not going to have a flashy car or a flashy house, and I'm not allowed to yell at people. Nobody bows when they meet me. So that's a low power distance culture. So where do you think Canada is on this values continuum? Well, Canada is more towards the low power distance end of things. It's not really acceptable in Canadian culture to demonstrate that you've got a lot of power over someone. And this is very true in most workplaces. So your boss will probably not dress that much differently than anyone else. Your boss will not address people differently. You won't address your boss differently. So there's no real overt display of the power that your boss actually has, even though he or she does have that power. So we're very much on the low power distance side of things. So what happens when people from different cultures meet and they have different values in terms of power distance? So if someone, for example, from a high power distance culture comes into Canada, which is a low power distance culture, what happens? It's actually quite challenging. If that person had a lot of power in that high power distance culture, it can be very humbling to come into a context like Canada, which is low power distance. So that person is actually not allowed to show his or her power and wealth and so on. So it's a little bit humbling and very frustrating, actually. The other way that it's challenging, if someone from a high power distance culture who doesn't have a lot of power comes into Canada. And that person is kind of used to demonstrating that someone else has more power than him or her. So they're used to bowing, or they're used to using titles, or they're used to behaving in a particular way that shows that the person has more power than him or her. So, but when that happens in a low power distance culture, people are like, kind of, what are you doing? Why are you talking to me in a different way? Why are you calling me sir this, or ma'am this, or doctor this, or teacher this? It's a little bit strange. It's not as challenging emotionally for that person coming from the high power distance culture, but some adjustment does need to be made. That person needs to get used to not using formal titles with people who have power and not addressing them in any way that's particularly different. The next values continuum is all about how decisions are made. So at one end of the continuum, we have a hierarchical decision-making process. So decisions are made top down. So the person at the top tells everyone all the way down what to do and how to do it. On the other end of the continuum, we have a bottom-up or a participatory type of decision-making, where everyone at all layers of the organization are involved in that decision-making process. So where does Canada fall on this values continuum? We do tend to be more towards the participatory side of things, but that is on average. It's not true for every single organization. We see quite a bit of variation in terms of this values continuum depending upon the type of organization that's in place and also the field that that organization operates in. So for example, a very high risk, high uncertainty type organization will tend to be a little bit more hierarchical in terms of its decision making. An organization that is in a less risky type of sector will tend to be a little bit more on the participatory side of things. So in general, Canadian organizations are towards the participatory end, but there will be some variation depending upon the field that that organization is operating in. What happens when someone from one end of the continuum goes into an organization or cultural context that's at the other end? So challenges arise when someone comes from a hierarchical decision-making culture into a non-hierarchical or participatory one. Someone from a hierarchical decision-making culture won't actually be comfortable expressing his or her opinion because in a hierarchical decision-making system, a person's opinion doesn't matter unless he or she is sitting at the top of the hierarchy. So offering opinion can actually be very challenging for someone coming from a hierarchical decision-making culture into a more participatory one. And the other issue when someone's going from a hierarchical one to a participatory one is the decision-making process just usually takes a bit longer when everyone's offering opinions and getting involved in the decision. So that person has to get used to decisions sometimes taking a little bit longer in a participatory type decision-making model. And going from the reverse is also challenging. So going from a participatory one into a hierarchical decision-making culture, the person or the individual can feel like he or she is being shut down because the opinions that he or she is offering don't get heard or they're not even asked for. So going from either end of this continuum can be challenging regardless of which direction that change is going in. The next values continuum is all about individualism versus collectivism. So this is about the individual or the group. Mostly this pertains to who decisions affect. So in an individualistic society, people make decisions based on what's best for them. So what's best for me in this particular decision, that's what I'm going to decide. Whereas in a collectivist type culture, people make decisions based on what's best for the whole group. And what's best for the whole group might not actually be the best for that particular individual, but that individual will accept what is best for the group. So Canada is an interesting transition in this regard. We used to be quite far on the individualism side of this continuum. So we made decisions very much based on what was good for us as an individual. Over the past 20 years, however, we've been shifting more over to the collectivist side of things. So looking more at what makes sense from a group perspective. And we do see this a lot more in organizations where there's more emphasis put on collaboration and teamwork versus individual performance. Once again, however, we'll see some variation from organization to organization and also from department to department within an organization. So for example, a sales department is usually fairly individualistic. People are rated and rewarded based on individual performance, whereas other departments might be much more collaborative and based on teamwork. So Canada has undergone a bit of a shift. We're shifting more over to the collectivism side of this continuum. We're definitely not way over there, though. We're sort of sitting in the middle, as Canadians tend to do. But there is variation from organization to organization. Making a change from one culture to the other in terms of individualism versus collectivism, once again, can be fairly challenging. Going from an individualistic type culture to a group or collectivistic type culture can make the individual feel like his or her value as an individual is not as high as it was in an individualistic society. And that person can feel a little bit constrained in terms of his or her decision-making and his or her performance. Going from a group or collectivist type culture into an individualistic type culture is equally challenging because in a group culture, the group tends to carry everybody along with it. So if you're a little bit weaker or you don't want to do quite as much work, that kind of gets covered up with the whole group. But in an individualistic society, there's really nowhere to hide. you're either strong or weak on your own. And that's a big mental and emotional challenge for people to get through when they're moving from a group type culture into an individualistic type culture. There's nowhere to hide in an individualistic culture. The next values continuum is uncertainty avoidance. And uncertainty avoidance is all about the comfort level that people have with risk. So in a culture that is high uncertainty avoidance, people in this culture are not that comfortable taking risk. So they'll do a lot of planning and they'll have a lot of procedures and policies and processes in place in order to minimize risk as much as possible. On the other end of the continuum, we have low uncertainty avoidance. And people in these types of cultures are quite comfortable with the idea of risk. They don't mind taking chances because they know that if there's risk, there's actually a high reward at the end if everything works out. And they're willing to take that chance. So where does Canada sit in terms of uncertainty avoidance? We do tend to be more on the high uncertainty avoidance side of this continuum. So we do have a lot of policies, a lot of procedures, a lot of planning in order to minimize risk. So we're not that comfortable with the idea of taking risk. The culture that's probably highest on the other end, so low uncertainty avoidance, would be the United States, particularly in the business sector. They're very much into risk-taking, and this is why we see a lot of innovation in that particular culture, because innovation is risky, and people are willing to take that risk. Canada's not really on that side of the continuum. We are more on the high uncertainty avoidance side of things. An interesting illustration of this particular continuum is the recent financial crisis that happened in the United States. The reason the financial crisis happened is because of this values continuum. So financial organizations within the United States and the government itself were very comfortable with taking risks. So these organizations created interesting but very risky financial tools and pushed them as far as they could. Well, unfortunately, it all collapsed around them, so they experienced the downside of taking risk. We didn't see a similar financial crisis in Canada because our financial institutions are just not comfortable taking risk. So we have policies and procedures in place that did not allow those same financial tools to take root within our financial system. So the downside was that people didn't accumulate massive amounts of wealth, but the upside was that we didn't have this crazy financial implosion when the risk basically just exploded in people's faces. So that's a really good example of the difference between a high uncertainty avoidance culture like Canada, where we have financial laws and rules and processes in place, and a low uncertainty avoidance culture like the United States, where they didn't have these policies and procedures and laws in place. And unfortunately, in this particular instance, they paid a bit of a price for that. So what happens when someone moves from one side of the continuum to the other? People going from a low uncertainty avoidance culture into a high uncertainty avoidance culture really get frustrated by all of the planning and the procedures and the rules and policies that they have to follow. So they just get very constrained by this idea they can't do anything without breaking a law or stepping on someone's toes or not following a procedure and so on. So that's a challenging transition to make. It's also challenging the other way, simply because if you're not used to working with uncertainty and dealing with risk, it's just very uncomfortable. The next values continuum is all about who has to follow the rules that are in place. And once again, there's two sides to this. On one side, we have what's called universalism. And this is the idea that all of the rules and all of the laws in a culture apply to every single person in exactly the same way. So there's no special treatment that anyone gets. On the other side is what's called particularism. It's a bit of a tongue twister. The idea with particularism is that some of the laws apply to you and some don't, based on who you are. So you can kind of work your way around laws just because of who you are. And you can say, well, that doesn't apply to me. So Canada is very much on the universalism side of things. We very much believe that all of the laws should be applied equally and fairly to every single person in the culture. What happens when someone moves from one side to the other side? The worst type of transition is going from particularism to universalism. If you're used to having special rules or special laws applied just to you, or if you're used to working your way around the different laws that are in place, for example, bribing your way out of something, or just bringing your friends in to help you out, or friends in high places to help you out, and then you come into a universalistic culture, It's very challenging because the same things that you could do to make yourself successful don't work. They actually get you in trouble with the law. So that's a pretty challenging transition to make. The other transition from universalism to particularism is also challenging because in universalism, there's an expectation that if you follow the laws and follow the rules, you'll be successful and you'll have the same outcome as everyone else. Well, that doesn't happen in particularism. So if you have an expectation, if you follow the law and follow the rules, that you'll get this outcome, it's very disappointing and very frustrating in a particularistic society when that doesn't happen. The next values continuum is all about status and how we get status and how we keep status. So in some cultures, there's what is called ascribed status. That means you just get status and power and prestige based on who you are. So what your family name is, for example. That's a really big one in terms of ascribed status. So for example, Prince William has ascribed status because he happened to be born into the royal family. On the other side of this continuum is achieved status. That means I get status and prestige based on the work I've done. So I study hard and I work hard. I get lots of degrees and I just really put my heart and soul into everything I do. That's achieved status or merit. So Canada falls quite strongly or quite conclusively on the achieved status side of this particular continuum. We believe if we work hard, we study hard, we get ourselves educated, then we'll be successful. What happens when someone goes from one side to the other side in this one? Well, the hardest transition is actually from ascribed to achieved. So if I come from a culture where I have a lot of ascribed status, so based on my family name, for example, and I come to a culture where status is given by achievement or based on achievement, I'm going to find that a little bit problematic because I'm going to expect to have status in that society based on who I am, but I don't get it because I haven't accomplished anything. It's equally frustrating going from the achieved side to the ascribed side because in an ascribed status culture, no matter how hard I work, no matter how many degrees I have, people still don't give me status because maybe I don't have the right family name, for example. The next values continuum is called time orientation. And this is not quite what it sounds like. It's not about whether people pay attention to being at meetings on time and finishing on time and so on. Time orientation is really about the perspective that people in that culture have on time and have on events. So if I have a short-term time orientation, I live very much in the now. So what's happening now is where my energy is focused and what I'm most concerned about. So where am I at now? Whereas a long-term time orientation means that I'm very much focused on what the future is looking like. So I will endure hardship now because I know that my hard work and my hardship now is going to get me something in the future. So I very much bank on the fact that I'm building a better future for myself. So Canada is quite strongly on the long-term orientation in terms of time. We very much believe in working hard now so that we have a good future. So I'm going to work hard now, pay off my mortgage so I have a nice house. I'm going to work hard now so that I can take my vacation in a year or 2 years and so on. So we do have very much a long-term time orientation. We're thinking very strongly about the future. Moving from one side of this continuum to the other is not quite as challenging as with some of the other cultures, but there are still some issues that arise. If I'm going from a short-term culture into a long-term orientation, a time orientation culture, I'm kind of going to be a bit of a fish out of water. So if I'm constantly focused on living in the now, but everyone around me is planning for the future, I'm going to be a bit of a misfit because I want to have fun now and enjoy things now, but everyone else is focused on the future. And it's equally frustrating going the other way because if I'm a long-term thinker, but I'm in a short-term culture, I don't have anyone else to plan with, right? Everyone else is focused on the now, whereas I'm focused on the future. The final values continuum we'll look at is one called knowledge versus performance. And in some cultures, the education system is very much focused on knowledge. So the role of the teacher is to impart knowledge to the students, and the role of the students is to take that knowledge into themselves and memorize it. And so a lot of the education system is based around rote memorization. On the other side of the continuum is what we call the performance side of things. In this type of system and culture, students are very much moving towards what can they do with the knowledge. So they get this knowledge, but then how can they use it, or are they able to use it effectively? This values continuum is very evident in a technical workplace when people come from different cultural backgrounds. So if someone comes from a culture where the education emphasis was on knowledge, he or she will have a lot of knowledge. They'll have a lot of facts in their heads. They'll be able to, they've memorized a lot of formulas and so on. But if they're going into a performance type organization, they won't be as confident applying what they know. So their bosses will be a little bit puzzled and frustrated because this person supposedly knows a lot because he or she has the education, but can't apply it or is not confident applying it. And we do see this quite frequently because Canadian organizations are on the performance side of things. And if people come in with strong knowledge but weak performance ability, supervisors and bosses are just, first of all, very frustrated, and then they're not quite sure what to do because they've got this well-educated person who's not confident applying that education in a performance. There are a lot more values continuums out there. So all you have to do is Google values continuum and you'll find a lot of more additional values that you can look at in order to understand that core, that center of a culture. The ones we've gone through are the ones that are most relevant to organizations. And these are values continuums that help us to understand some of the miscommunication and the conflict that does arise in a multicultural organization. So what does happen when people from different cultural backgrounds interact in an organization? So we have culture 1 coming up against culture 2. So what happens when these two cultures meet? There's a few different concepts that we need to think about when we're thinking about this interaction or this meeting of two different cultures. The first idea we have to keep in mind is that we're all human beings. So there's a lot of sameness that happens when we meet someone from another culture. So we all get hungry, for example, when we don't eat. We all get grumpy when we're tired. We all have families that we care about, and we all want to be successful in our jobs. So this sameness is always there. Even though we come from different cultural backgrounds, we've got some sameness going on. But at the same time, we do have differences. And we've taken a look at what some of these differences are. And the core differences really are at that values level. And this is what plays out in a lot of organizations. So the first thing to keep in mind when people from two different cultural backgrounds meet is that there's some sameness going on, and then there's also some differentness going on. And both of these are at play at the same time. Another way to understand this sameness and differentness that's going on at the same time is to put things into layers. So if we have a triangle, and then we have 3 layers to this triangle, the base layer is our sameness layer. This is our human nature layer. So we're all human beings. We all have certain characteristics based on the fact that we are human beings. So as I've said before, we get hungry when we don't eat, we get grumpy when we're tired. The next layer is our socialized layer, or our cultural layer. And this is the layer of us that we've learned because we've been a part of one or more different groups or different cultures. And then the final layer in this triangle is the individual layer. This is who we are as a person based on our genetic makeup and also our lifelong personal experiences that are very unique to us. So every individual has these 3 layers to him or her, and this helps us understand the fact that we've got sameness going on and differentness going on at the same time. So when people from two different cultural backgrounds meet, we can have some good stuff happening and we can have some not good stuff happening because of this differentness. And so we'll take a look at the bad stuff because obviously we don't want that happening in our organizations. And then we'll take a look at the good stuff because this is what we do want to have happen. The good stuff can help our organization become really strong and really effective and very innovative. The bad stuff obviously brings our organization down. So on the side of the bad stuff, we have, first of all, fear. So when we meet someone from a different cultural background, we can simply be afraid of them because they're different. Okay? We can also have power struggles going on. So my differentness is stronger than yours, and so my differentness is going to win out. You're going to do what I say because I have more power. So we can get this fight for power going on. We can also get negative stereotyping going on. Stereotyping is something that we naturally do as human beings to try and organize our worlds and organize our encounters with different human beings. So stereotyping in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It helps us organize our experiences. Where stereotyping becomes a negative thing is when we put negative judgments on those stereotypes. So you belong to a particular group, and you behave in a particular way, and then I come along and I put a negative judgment on that. I say, I don't like how you're behaving, that's wrong, that's negative, you're not capable, you're not competent. So negative stereotyping is another not so good thing that can happen. And the very worst thing that can happen is we get racism happening. Racism is basically treating people very badly, and it's an excuse to treat people badly based on what cultural group they belong to or what race they belong to. So it's kind of a justification for treating people badly. I don't like the group you belong to, so I'm going to treat you badly. That's the bad stuff that happens when people from two different cultures meet. But there's a lot of good stuff, and this is the stuff that we really want to tap into with our organizations. When people from different cultural backgrounds meet, they bring different perspectives to the same situation. And if we're smart about it, we can use those different perspectives to generate a lot of different ideas for our organization. So if we're troubleshooting something, for example, the more perspectives we have on that problem, the more ideas we have to work from in order to solve the problem. So these multiple perspectives are really valuable. We may not always follow the perspectives that people bring to the table, but it's really important just to hear them because that gives us more ideas to work with as we move our organizations forward. Then the other really good thing that can happen is people just become comfortable with things being different. They don't need everyone to be the same and act the same and believe the same. They're just really comfortable in and of themselves with things or with people being different around them. And with that level of comfort with differentness comes respect. So we can learn to respect people's differences and actually enjoy them. So a multicultural organization can be a very enjoyable place to work because of all that differentness that people bring to the table. So how do we become comfortable working with people who are different from us, who come from these different cultural backgrounds? There's a concept that's been developed to define this concept or this ideal that we want to take ourselves towards. The concept is called intercultural competence. And intercultural competence is simply the ability to work effectively and communicate effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds so that we can all move forward and be successful. There are different sets of skills that come into this idea or this competence, intercultural competence. Let's take a look at what these skills are. The first set of skills are called observation skills. These are skills that simply allow us to notice difference and to notice what's going on around us. So we can notice, okay, this is different and that is different. So noticing our observation skills is our starting point. We have to figure out what's going on around us in order to then put strategies into place to deal with what's going on around us. The second set of skills are listening skills. Listening skills allow us to really be closely attuned to what someone is communicating to us. Listening is not just listening for the words, but we're also using body language and we're using context to give us more information about what that person is communicating to us. So listening skills are very key to intercultural competence. The next skill set is actually not really a skill, but it's simply knowledge. We need to have a lot of information and a deep understanding of what culture is. And I've taken you through quite a lot of the knowledge that's associated with intercultural competence. So we have to know what culture is. We have to know these different concepts and frameworks that allow us to understand culture. We need to understand these values continuums and how different cultural groups are different at their very core. So knowledge is the third piece that's really important in intercultural competence. The fourth skill set for intercultural competence are analytical skills. This is simply the ability to take a look at what's going on, take our knowledge, take all the information we've collected by observing and by listening, and start to figure out what's going on. So this helps us to figure out, okay, this cultural group the person comes from is here on the values continuum, and therefore they're going to have these challenges, or they're over here and they won't have challenges. So analytical skills really allow us to take all the information we've gathered and then start to figure out what's going on in this particular situation. The fifth set of skills are communication skills. So our observation skills and our listening skills and our knowledge allow us to gather lots of information, but then we have to communicate it back across that cultural divide in a way that the other people are going to understand it and process it. So communication skills are key here. We have to be able to clearly put our message out there so that other people can understand it and to minimize the miscommunication. The final set of skills for intercultural competence are interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills come into play because they allow us to balance the sameness and the differentness that's going on when we interact with people from different cultural backgrounds. Our tendency is to just focus on the differentness, but with interpersonal communication skills in which we understand people and we empathize with people or we sympathize with people, we can balance this sameness and this differentness, and we can figure out, can we work with the differentness because of the sameness, or is the differentness too great and we have to work on that in order to be able to work together effectively. So interpersonal skills are really about being able to work with people, to enjoy working with people, and to take the time to understand people. So now that you know all of this information and you have this knowledge about culture and the different frameworks for understanding culture and how to apply them, and now that you also know this concept of intercultural competence, what are your next steps? Well, intercultural competence is what you want to aim for, because when you have intercultural competence, you can function very effectively and successfully in your multicultural organization. But intercultural competence is not something that you can achieve overnight. You build it up through experience, through reading, through observing, through improving your listening skills, and so on. So what you want to do from here on in is really focus on your intercultural competence and look at the different skill sets that compose that or that comprise that competence and figure out, where do you need to do the work. So are your observation skills strong? Are your listening skills strong? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the analytical skills? Do you have the communication skills? Or do you have the interpersonal skills? Which ones are strong? Which ones are weak? Where do you want to put your effort in order to improve your overall intercultural competence? So I'll leave this one up to you. We've given you a chart in your handout, so fill it in, evaluate your ability in each of these sub-skills or these skill sets, and figure out your own personal action plan for improving your intercultural competence. When you improve your intercultural competence, you become much more effective functioning in a multicultural organization. To wrap up the session, we've provided you with 3 resources that we really recommend in order to help you further explore being effective in a multicultural organization. The first of these is work by Geert Hofstede. Remember, he's the researcher who came up with these ideas of values continuums. So his work takes you much more deeply into the core elements of a culture. So I highly recommend that book. The other 2 resources are from Lionel Laroche. Lionel is a French engineer who has also studied and worked in the United States and currently resides in Canada. He's done a lot of research on multicultural organizations that are also engineering organizations. So he's put together the multicultural piece with the technical and engineering piece. So I highly recommend his work so that you can understand what happens in multicultural engineering or technical organizations. Thanks very much for watching, and all the best as you work towards developing your own intercultural competence so that you can be more effective in a multicultural organization. Because in this day and age, every single organization is a multicultural organization.